Hey Eric, how's it going, man?
Oh, as everything's been going great. How about you?
Everything's great. No one in crypto is suffering. My portfolio isn't hurting. I'm in denial. Man, what a week.
Yeah, definitely.
How are things on your end? Did you get any? I know you don't like the term stablecoin per se, but like, did you get any more interested in your particular version of stability when all of this happened?
Definitely. Like, I actually wrote a whole Medium article on UST and how it crashed, and also comparing Mel to it. But basically, the difference is really that because of UST's design, it was very under collateralized, but Mel is over collateralized. So it's not going to be vulnerable to the kind of problems we're seeing with Terra and UST and that kind of thing.
I mean, and it's just a whole different model, right? And I did read the article that you're
Mm-hmm.
mentioning, and I can say that there's some very interesting thoughts in there,
Mm-hmm.
especially about how fussily the term algorithmic gets thrown
Yeah,
around.
definitely. I think like I really don't like that term because it really implies that, there are stablecoins that are backed by assets and there are stablecoins that are somehow magically backed by an algorithm. Now the problem is that that's not the case. Even with algorithmic stablecoins, so to speak, when the stablecoin price starts dropping and you need to support the peg, there needs to be some kind of asset, some kind of value that's being used to support the peg. Now that value might not come from like a pile of assets sitting on chain, but it needs to come from somewhere, right? So for example, in UST's case, the design is that that money comes from the money raised by printing more Luna and selling the Luna, right, for UST. And that's kind of the implicit collateral of UST. So UST is not unbacked. It's simply backed by this value store, which unfortunately wasn't even close to enough. But I think like the way you should think about a stablecoin is always, does it have enough collateral? And not, okay, it's an algorithmic stablecoin, so we don't need to think about collateral. No, you still have to think about collateral. It actually makes it more important because algorithmic stablecoins have, weird collaterals that are not always obvious where the collateral comes from. So you got to analyze it and think about it. So yeah,
And I pretty much can think that he got paranoid himself about this whole thing, and that's why he started the whole BTC reserve thing. Maybe way too late, or I don't know. Like, isn't it like a fun coincidental series of events?
well, I think like yes, I think that you could say that maybe he felt like UST was not fully collateralized and therefore he got into BTC. But I actually think that whole thing also relies on this bad narrative that kind of like Luna doesn't, like UST doesn't have backing unless there's BTC backing it. No, Luna, like UST has backing, right? UST's backing is the inflation extractable value of Luna. I think the problem here is that Do Kwon should have instead improved that, right? Should have made it redesign, improve the system so that the
Mhm.
inflation extractable value of Luna is much higher. And that's not that hard to do actually, because all he needed to do is stop paying people 20% on Anchor, stop propping up UST demand so much, right? Instead, you should build use cases on Terra and increase Luna demand in a way that doesn't rely on UST. And therefore, UST can have its backing. Instead, what their whole ecosystem did was that they tried to increase the demand for Luna and the demand for the Terra blockchain by increasing the demand for UST. And that actually does the opposite because it issues more UST without increasing the backing of the Luna value that doesn't come from UST, which is the only part that actually counts when you need the collateral.
I think we also skipped the whole part where you introduce yourself because we did it on the other recording that never came
Yeah,
to light. But for those that didn't watch the previous interview, I don't know about you. Would you like to just explain a little bit who you are and what Themelio is,
definitely. So
and why you're very relevant to the stablecoin discussion?
yeah, so basically, my name is Eric. I am the founder and CEO of Themelio, which is a new public blockchain that really focuses on security, stability, and immutability. It focuses on kind of making a very small and very robust blockchain with the strongest possible security. And that's kind of like the upshot of what I'm doing. And why are stablecoins relevant is because one of the really unique things about Themelio is that its native currency, MEL, is what I call a non-fiat stablecoin. So it's not a stablecoin in the sense that it's not tied to the US dollar, but it has a relatively stable real purchasing power because it is pegged to a unit I call the DOSC, or day of sequential computation. So like, I'm not going to talk all about that now because you can read about it on the website, but the upshot is that MEL can actually have a relatively stable value without reference to fiat currencies, and most importantly, without needing oracles and without needing any kind of trusted party. And that's like a really big breakthrough. We don't have any other crypto asset that even tries to do this, right? So even coins like RAI that don't peg to the US dollar still require oracles that use the US dollar. So that's why I'm kind of relevant to stablecoins, because I'm essentially building a alternative to US dollar stablecoins.
And in the article that we were referring previously, I'll tell you, boy, I did my homework. Well, I've been learning more and more and getting more involved in Themelio lately. In the blog post that you refer and that you wrote, I think like another point that it's actually quite interesting, and it's interesting in kind of like a scary way because it highlights how a lot of things are done wrong in the stablecoin world. It's that most projects do not have a clear answer for the question, what happens if the peg breaks, what happens if your coin goes down, what brings it back up. And actually, Themelio did experience a miscalculation of the DOSC value recently.
Yeah.
Would you like to talk about this and how do you bring the peg back to normal?
Well,
and what are
like,
the issues that can happen? Yeah.
Yeah, in Themelio's case, what happened was more like we had a bad minting algorithm, and therefore it was measuring the DOSC value incorrectly. And that's fine, because once we fix it, then the currency just pegs to the new correct value. Like the whole feedback loop takes care of that. But generally, I think you're probably referring to the part of my blog post when I talk about when in emergencies you need to depeg. You need to change the peg so that the system doesn't collapse. Is that correct? Is that the part where you're referring to when I talk about
yes.
Yeah, so like in Mel's case, it's quite interesting because in Mel's case, when we actually have like a huge market panic and everybody tries to sell the tokens, we don't actually try to rigidly keep a peg anymore. Instead, what we do is that in Themelio's whole monetary policy engine, which is called Melmint, how it works is that how much MEL is printed or SIM is printed to keep the peg is proportional to the amount of MEL and SIM liquidity on the Themelio blockchain. So what that means is that in a panic where people are withdrawing these assets off-chain and trying to sell them to other people, that liquidity is going to drop and the peg is going to break because the mechanism no longer has the capital to start pegging the system. And that's completely intentional because the alternative to this is that if we rigidly try to keep the peg in a case where the peg is no longer viable because it's under collateralized or because of illiquidity of the backing asset, then we end up in the UST/Luna situation. We hyperinflate the backing asset, which is in our case SIM, which is Themelio's proof of stake token, and we still don't save the peg, and then both SIM and MEL go to zero. And that's an unacceptable outcome. Instead, we let the peg float for a while when there's no liquidity in the system. And do you also keep in mind that like this is probably only going to happen in really extreme cases where you have like a massive amount of selling activity on the MEL, and SIM is not liquid enough to soak up all the MELs being sold. But I don't according to the modeling we've done, Melmint is not going to enter a situation where it is actually insolvent, where there's actually too much MEL to absorb for the SIM. It's only liquidity issues that this temporary depegging system fixes. And in my blog post, I actually talk about this too, which is that even when you have a fully collateralized stablecoin, if your collateral is illiquid, meaning that you cannot sell them all at once at a reasonable price, then you need some mechanism of breaking the peg in panics so that you don't cause a run. Because the issue is this, right? If the collateral cannot be sold quickly enough, then if everybody comes and redeems their stablecoins simultaneously, then the stablecoin is going to break, right? And everything's going to break because the collateral will be sold at a bad price because of its illiquidity. The whole thing will become insolvent and everything will go to zero. Now, the thing is that if people think this is going to happen, they are going to start selling the stablecoin because they feel like they need to get out before other people get out, right? And then everybody does so, and then the whole system the run becomes self-reinforcing and the system collapses, even though the stablecoin is over-collateralized. And the way you fix this is by saying, okay, in this situation, I'm just not going to keep the peg as tightly anymore. And what this allows is it allows the stablecoin value to drop below its peg a little bit, and then the run stops, because you no longer have an incentive to get out before everybody else, because in a sense, everybody is already too late. I already can't get my $1 out if I exit now. So there's no reason for me to try to get out before other people do. Because,
isn't that like still the same thing? Sorry.
It's not,
I'm just a bit confused by this argument.
It's not, because the case is, the difference is here, right? Because in the previous case, if I think everybody else is selling the stablecoin, I need to get out before them because the stablecoin is going to go to zero afterwards. In this case, even if I think everybody else is going to sell the stablecoin, if I think the stablecoin is worth, let's say, at least 80 cents, I'm going to not sell it at 80 cents. I'm going to wait until it's at a better price, right? So that's the difference, as in the everybody selling part wouldn't cause it to go to zero. And I think like the easy way of understanding this is think about it this way, right? If you don't break the peg, the first person to sell the stablecoin gets much more money than the last person, right? The first person would get $1, the last person would get zero. So everybody wants to be the first person and not the last person, and therefore everybody sells the stablecoin.
Right. So if you're rushing through the door, you rather get there first.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if you allow depegging, what happens is that if there is some issue with the collateral, then everybody gets 0.8, for example. Everybody gets 80 cents. Then I don't have an incentive to sell the stablecoin before everybody else sells. Because no matter whether I'm first or last, I'm not going to get my full dollar back. Neither am I going to get zero. So this is really like... I think this is really important, and I think that, like, especially because a lot of stablecoins are backed by relatively illiquid assets. For example, DAI's collateral. They're trying to diversify DAI's collateral into things like off-chain assets and even land and things like that. Like, that's actually a really good idea, but the issue is that those assets are not very liquid, and therefore, I do think that systems like that require a way of automatically letting the peg temporarily break, like essentially suspend convertibility when there's a liquidity problem. And I think like that's actually a really good mechanism. Yeah.
Is there any, because I heard the theory that DAI is actually incurring a lot of problems by taking collateral in USDC, because then if the USDC via some regulatory problem or pressure gets frozen, or that just puts a lot of strain into DAI's model. What do you think about that kind of thing?
I do agree, actually. I think that it was a mistake for DAI to take on USDC as collateral. I actually preferred the period of time when DAI was only collateralized by ETH. I think like that was much simpler. But I do think like kind of it's inevitable what happened almost because USDC is so popular, right? Everybody trusts USDC. So at the time, it did seem like a good solution for them. So I wouldn't blame them too much for doing that. But I do feel like they should try to get rid of the USDC as much as possible.
And I also think like that if you have stable coins backing other stable coins backing other stable coins, then that just sets you up for a total systemic disaster where if one fails, everything fails.
Well, yeah, like assuming that the stable coins on the bottom of this tree do fail first, right? If the ones on the top fail, it's fine. So
And one thing that I'd like to go back to, because I found this really interesting, is that you mentioned that the UST demand was artificially pumped up by
yeah,
Anchor. And well, you have to totally agree. Like the protocol decided to create a use case for its own emissions by giving people this incentive. And so that just makes me wonder, how do you think mail is going to be used in your ecosystem, and what kind of use cases would you like to foster for it?
yeah. So I think that there are two main use cases, right? So the first use case is simply as sound decentralized money. And I think that's a huge use case because right now we don't actually have a currency that can do that, right? The Bitcoiners always say they want people to start paying people in Bitcoin and selling things in Bitcoin. But the problem is because Bitcoin is so volatile, it's very difficult to actually, for example, run your whole store, accounting everything in terms of Bitcoins and setting prices in Bitcoins, right? Like you
Right.
always do that in dollars and just convert to Bitcoins as you go. But Mel is actually suitable for that use case. Like, if you imagine like a anonymous online market or something like that where people trade goods, Mel is a really good currency to price things in. And also more generally in DeFi, Mel is also very good as a kind of like reference for prices because it is decentralized and Oracle free, and yet it has a stable value. So that's kind of like the first most obvious use case, right? And as sound decentralized money. The second use case would simply be when people actually want to use the Themelio blockchain, they would use the MEL to pay transaction fees. So in that respect, demand for MEL would be similar to demand for ETH, right? If somebody is running some roll-up on Themelio or they're developing some protocol on Themelio, they would need MELs to pay transaction fees. And MELs would also be the natural reserve currency for kind of the whole Themelio ecosystem. So that's how I think MEL should be used. I definitely don't plan on just paying people 20% to buy MELs because that doesn't really help, right? As I mentioned in my blog post, it actually makes the stability worse.
And I mean, like at some point, someone might, right? But like then there's like the magic of blockchains that you cannot stop them from trying to do so. You can just hope that
Well,
your chain has.
well, not really, right? Because if you think about Anchor, where did Anchor's 20% come from? It actually just mostly came from a subsidy, right? Like there is this yield reserve, and like the Terra team paid Anchor to offer those yields, and they were losing money on it. They were just doing this as kind of like a marketing gimmick almost to get people to use Anchor. I think like so I think like that's basically a really foolish use of a large amount of money, and unless people want to do that on Themelio, I don't see why that would happen. And also, even if somebody does that on Themelio, right, because Themelio is a very general purpose blockchain, I wouldn't expect one or two, badly designed DeFi protocols to dominate the demand for MEL. Instead, like there would just be a very small portion of overall demand.
And it's like a mail collateralized USD pegged stablecoin in the horizon. Anytime do you think
No,
about that, or do you think like?
I think like somebody might develop it. I mean, it's a nice currency to use for this kind of collateralization, but I'm just not that interested in US dollar peg stablecoins. I think like they're like too systemically important in DeFi already. I would like to see less and less use of them.
Because I mean, you could very easily make the case for it, like you just did, kind of, that just like a DAI design where ETH was the only backing asset. That would be really simple, right? Like just like a DAI, but backed with mail.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, like you said, we're too reliant on USDC in USD pegs through the
Yeah.
whole of DeFi.
Yeah, and also I think that if you want a USD equivalent, I honestly feel like you could just use USDC, right? Because you need to trust the USD anyway, right? Like, why would you have a problem with using like a centralized solution? So like that's really how I feel about stablecoins. I feel like the whole idea of a decentralized US dollar stablecoin is kind of self-contradictory, and if you want decentralization, you got to give up the US dollar.
Well, it kind of is. And you're right. If you want to be a total normie and use USDC, like no one's gonna give you shit for it, really. Like
Yeah.
it's just we use the US dollar for everything else, anyways. Um, in my research, also, like I've been like, because last time we recorded an episode that didn't go live because of like problems with computers, and
Yeah.
that sucked. But you totally destroyed the research paper we'd done for Themelio because a bunch of the assumptions there were wrong, and so like, and we haven't finished revisiting, so we're not gonna be doing that time.
Yeah.
But ever since I started looking into it to see what went wrong there, I got a lot more interested in one of the roles from the in the Themelio ecosystem, because I think it's three, isn't it? Auditors, stakers, and clients.
Yeah.
So like, I'm just curious, or maybe I'm not getting this correctly, but like, can you just explain the role of auditors and how do you incentivize them not to misbehave?
Yeah, so auditors, I think, is just kind of a fancy word for a full node. That's basically what they are. And why I call them auditors is because just like full nodes on other blockchains, they check the validity of every like block, and they refuse to relay anything that's bad, right? So that's similar to other blockchains. The special part is that the auditors slash full nodes in Themelio play an important role when consensus for some reason completely fails. So if the stakers, a majority of the stakers sign on a bad block, right? Something that's invalid. In that case, you can't recover through slashing or any other mechanism within the blockchain, because the majority of bad stakers can also censor anything on the blockchain that punishes them, right? So that's the problem here. But the auditors, however, can gather evidence of consensus misbehavior. And that evidence is very simple. It's simply 2/3 signatures and a bad block, right? And then it gossips these things. And what this does is that it shuts down the network, essentially. Like every client or auditor that sees such a proof would shut down and close down the whole network. And the reason for this is actually, it makes it so that if you are attacking the staker set and you take control over 2/3 of the stakers, and you, let's say, try to do double spending or try to make some invalid transaction, you cannot get very far with that because the whole network would just shut down. That's really the purpose of the auditor network. And it's not all that unique. Vitalik actually, in one of his blog posts, also mentioned this idea of defaulting to chaos versus defaulting to victory in the case of a 51% attack. And the idea is that defaulting to victory is just that most clients are just compatible with bad fork made by the attacker and just accept it. And defaulting to chaos is basically the whole system falls apart, and nobody knows what's going on, and the value of the coin drops and things like that. And defaulting to chaos is the best we can do when the attacker controls most of the network. So, and the auditors just ensure that by having this inbuilt mechanism for causing chaos, so to speak. So that's the purpose of the auditors. Now, you asked a really good question, which is that what incentivizes them? And that's actually not very important. And the reason is because malicious auditors are harmless because they can't shut down the network or do anything else without proof, cryptographic proof, that the stakers are bad. Right? So if I'm a bad auditor and I just lie to people saying, oh, look, the stakers are bad, and clients see my proof and say, no, this is not actually proof that the stakers are bad, I'm just going to get kicked out of the peer-to-peer network and nobody will listen to me. I don't cause any damage. So all that we need to ensure is that honest auditors can talk to honest auditors. It doesn't matter if 99% are evil. Right? So therefore, incentivization is much less of an issue. In practice, I think that most auditors would be the same people who run full nodes on today's blockchains. So people who want a local copy of the blockchain for latency reasons. Let's say they're running a lot of queries on the blockchain. I mean, block explorers would definitely run an auditor node. Also, people who have bad internet, right? They don't want to need to RPC connect to a remote node. Also, people who run layer 2s, people who run upper layer protocols, they typically really benefit if they can have their own full node to, do transactions on. Just the same kind of people who would run an Ethereum full node, honestly, would run a Themelio auditor. It's just that in Themelio's case, they play a larger role in the security of the system.
I mean, as I have talked to you, I don't know. I never felt like you don't have the answer for something that I've presented to you, and that could be taken as a compliment or as an insult. Like I do mean it as a compliment. I do feel though like it is a new paradigm, and like all new paradigms, Themelio does suffer a bit from not being too easy to understand at first sight, or from people having to wrap their head around it in a way that they're not completely used to. So how do you think about this problem, or what do you think is like the way to go in terms of like bringing the masses into Themelio?
Yeah, so I think that is a problem, but I also think it's a problem that any kind of actually important technology faces, right? So when Ethereum first came out, a lot of people didn't know, why would you need that? We already have Bitcoin. Right? It didn't immediately catch on. I think that what made Ethereum eventually catch on was that people started discovering these really big use cases on top of Ethereum that they couldn't do with Bitcoin. And I think it's similar for Themelio. And I think, for example, a huge use case of Themelio is as a root of trust for non-blockchain applications. So that's a huge use case that existing blockchains are not really accomplishing. We don't really see, for example, peer-to-peer communication protocols using ENS names, right? Or anything kind of like outside of Web3, the DeFi and NFT and that kind of space, using public blockchains as a root of trust. And that's because existing blockchains are not very well designed for that. But Themelio is really perfectly suited for that role. And we actually, as a company, do plan on developing a lot of basic protocols and development kits for making those protocols a reality. And I think that once people see the kind of things that they can build on Themelio that can't be built on existing blockchains, that's when people will be really interested in building on Themelio.
I mean, and I had to ask when, but I mean, in your mind, how does the projected timeline look like?
Yeah,
roughly?
so I would say roughly like later this year, we would have like a public token sale and lots of people will start using the blockchain. I think that kind of these development kits and things like that would come out over the next few months or so, starting from the lower level, just smart contract language and libraries, that kind of thing, and building up to things like rollups, naming systems, and other basic infrastructure. And I think that a lot of this would also be developed by the community, right? Because, just like in Ethereum, it's not like Vitalik just wrote every single smart contract on Ethereum, right? It was really that he convinced, or not just him, but the whole Ethereum community convinced the world that you can build all of these really cool constructs on Ethereum, and then people came and built it. So I think for us now, the important part is really to attract the right kind of person who really sees the potential in Themelio.
And I had the chance to talk to people launching or working on layer ones before, but I don't think I've ever asked them this question. Um, when it comes to raising money for something like that, how do you put a value into what your into what your L1 is worth?
Yeah, I think like how you would be, of course, you can compare to other L1s in the aspects that, you know, Themelio shares with them, right? So for example, Themelio isn't all just about a new applications, right? Themelio is also just the competitors of blockchains like Celestia that I also think is better at doing what Celestia is trying to do than Celestia is. And we can compare to with other blockchains like this and see, okay, even if that's all we got, we have all these use cases. Even if like the bigger use cases don't pan out, we have all these use cases. And then we can also look at what those other bigger use cases are and how much of that market we can capture. Right? It's really because when I talk about, for example, decentralized communication, that's actually a really big space, including projects like Tor and like BitTorrent and things like that. There is a whole community of people who are really into that kind of thing. And if we can convince them to build protocols that use the blockchain as the root of trust, that is a lot of value there.
Hmm. But like, I mean, there's also something quite unique in there, which is like your the number of SIM that will ever be around. I think is it like 200 or something? It's a really low number, isn't it?
No, it's something like 2 million.
2 million, sorry, 200. I was thinking 200,000, but yeah, yeah, so something like 2 million. It's like I don't know. Are there any advantages or disadvantages of this number being so low? Because I often think like Bitcoin suffers from that. I often think that if Bitcoins were like more easily to account for, whereas like one, obviously you end up accounting them in like dollar price, right? In dollar
Mm-hmm.
value. So like if one is ridiculously pricey, like $66,000 or $28,000, then it's sort of like it doesn't really help the paradigm of like, so, because then you have to account in satoshis, which is like 1/10,000th of a unit. So I don't know. Do you think about this thing?
I don't think it's really important actually, because I don't think, for example, in Bitcoin, people necessarily need to buy one whole Bitcoin, right? I think like, you know, just account everything in micro Bitcoins, right? That's what I do. Also, keep in mind that SIM is not designed to be money, right? SIM is designed to be a proof of stake token. And one SIM being 1 millionth of the network actually makes calculating things easier, right? Like you can think, okay, if I have 1,000 SIMs, that's 1%, right? It's easier to kind of think of the numbers when you're thinking about the percentage of the whole staker set. Um, and that's why I think it's not a problem. And I intentionally made it so that one SIM is really big. For Mel, that's a very different story because Mel is a currency that I want people to use to price things and do accounting in Mel's case, I don't think that's a problem because 1 mel is 1 day of computation, which is, you know, give or take a few dozen cents. And that's a relatively common price range for just any world currency, right? So, you know, hamburgers would be like, I don't know, 20 mels. You know, it's very reasonable
Right.
to use. So that's different. Yeah.
I really, I mean, I've really enjoyed looking deeper into Themelio, and I've seen the community grow a lot. We were talking about this before recording about how it also seems like the airdrop helped a lot.
Of
But
course.
I don't know what other kinds of interest are you seeing from the general crypto community into your project?
Well, honestly, like up to now, I think a lot of people are just interested in the airdrop. A lot of people are also interested in minting because they find the concept of Mel really interesting and they want to play with it, right? So we actually, if you go to our block explorer, you'll see that every single block there's like several people minting coins. So our blockchain already is seeing a lot of activity. And by the way, it's a mainnet, right? This is the same blockchain that we are going to launch later this year. So like that's really nice. And I think like, however, I would want to see more interest from developers, but I think that once we release our developer toolkit, especially our smart contract language, Melodion, that's when I would expect to see more interest from developers, because we do have a really different programming paradigm compared to Ethereum smart contracts. We use UTXOs with purely functional covenants, and we have a really special language for that. And I think that'll be really interesting to a lot of people.
And what was that?
I think it's my door. It's okay.
Okay. Um, in general, I do feel like people are going to start wanting to build on top of this, just because I think and I told you this before. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it makes a lot more sense than thinking about Bitcoin in terms of it being money. It makes a lot more sense to think of mail occupying that space in a future world. I don't know. How do you feel about how you're about to go head in head with the Bitcoin community? Because I think that's a clash that's due to happen, and it's gonna be entertaining to watch for sure.
Yeah, I think that that's true. I think Themelio shares a lot of values with the Bitcoin community. Ultimately, what we want is the same as what the Bitcoin community wants. We want decentralized sound money. We want a neutral blockchain platform. We want, censorship resistance. We want, autonomy. Everything that the Bitcoiners want, we want. It's just that Themelio thinks that the way we get there is a little different, right? So, for example, Themelio doesn't really agree with Bitcoiners' antagonism towards proof of stake. Themelio also has an even stronger view on protocol immutability, and it also doesn't align with Bitcoin's ideas about a fixed supply money, right? We think that decentralized sound money should be flexible supply, but also non-fiat. So I think that it would be kind of a friendly competition, right? Because we ultimately want the same things. And it really is kind of up to the market and history to decide eventually which one is better. And I do think that Themelio is better. I do think that Bitcoin by itself can't actually actualize what the Bitcoiners want, because it is so limited. And it is, even though it is so limited, they still often have to compromise on immutability and security to push updates, while Themelio is both more secure and more immutable, and more flexible. And I think like that really jumps out of the whole false narrative that it's either like Bitcoin or it's like Solana with Ethereum and those newer chains, and you have to trade off security for flexibility. And Themelio is like, actually you can have both in the same blockchain.
Yeah, 100% agree. I do think like you're gonna be hardly criticized on the basis of what, I don't know, but like the Bitcoin community just finds these ways of like finding how to ridicule the people they do not want to agree with, because in the bottom I think you would agree on a lot of things. So like knowing how things often are, I know that they'll find one.
Although I actually don't really think so, because I think that usually when Bitcoiners criticize other people, it's generally for ideological reasons, right? Like Bitcoiners are really defensive of their whole ideals. And I don't actually think that Themelio would pose a problem in that area. I think that the disagreements would be more technical, right? Like whether proof of work is better or whether proof of stake is better, and things like that. But I don't think, for example, that Bitcoiners would feel towards Themelio the way they feel towards, let's say, I don't know, subsections of the Ethereum community, for example. I think that ideologically, Themelio is much closer to Bitcoin than to any other crypto project.
Do you feel the same way even when compared to like Bitcoin Cash or?
I actually do, yeah, because I think like the problems that those Bitcoin forks try to solve, typically they're trading off security for scalability and things like that, while Themelio is definitely on the security side of things.
And we deviated a bit from the whole thing on Terra and stablecoins and everything that just went down. But like, are there any thoughts that you would like to share with those listening to this about that particular situation?
About like the UST and Terra, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that basically my thoughts would be if you want a US dollar based stablecoin, I would personally just use DAI. I don't really think there's too much room actually in the market for advanced, weird US dollar pegged stablecoins. I think that like there are fundamental economic limitations here because if you want a fully collateralized stablecoin, you just need that much capital to make this much stablecoin, and no amount of like crazy algorithms can get around that. And if you see a stablecoin that claims it can, it's probably under collateralized and it'll probably collapse. So that's how, I guess what I would say. I think like stablecoins shouldn't be fancy. It should be really obvious that they work. And yeah.
And by the way, before you mentioned collaterals, and collaterally is a funny word because people make all types of associations with it, but like in reality, just having like the complete certainty that they have $1 and they're completely able to give you $1 per stable coin, that classifies as collateral, isn't it? But how much collateral do you think they should actually have in terms of like actual fiat?
I don't think they need any. I mean, I think like DAI, for example, when all of its collateral was in ETH, it works. I think
I know,
like
but I mean in like a USDT scenario when they're like going with that model, fiat for fiat.
what do you mean? Like how much collateral you need? You mean
Right,
how much collateral
because
you need for one stablecoin? Is
yeah,
that what you mean? Well, of course you need at least $1, right?
at least
And,
one for sure.
and if it is it depends on the volatility and depends on how liquid that asset is, but it definitely needs to be over collateralized. It needs to be more than $1. That's like the bottom line. And I think like even Tether, right? People say, okay, maybe they invested their reserve. Maybe they're not all dollars. That doesn't actually mean it's under collateralized, right? Under collateralized is a really serious problem. Like no stablecoin should ever be under collateralized. Under collateralized means that the total amount of the reserves is worth less than the total issuance. It's not about how much is in fiat, right? And whenever you have a situation where your whole stablecoin is under collateralized, it's basically dead. It's like it's insolvent, right? It's like a company that has more loans than assets. So, and the fact that your stablecoin is algorithmic doesn't make it any better, right? And I think like people should stop trying to make magical under collateralized stablecoins work because they're not going to work.
Cool. Yeah. With that, we can completely leave aside the UST situation.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, is there anything that you'd like to talk about that's related to the latest developments of Themelio?
Yeah, so I think that one really big thing is that recently we will be releasing mobile versions of our wallet, and that would make it much easier to hold Mel wherever you go. And after that, we will also be releasing more and more developer toolkits. Most importantly, we will be documenting our smart contract language, Melodion, in a lot more detail and have a nice website where you can learn all about it and start writing smart contracts on Themelio. And our language has actually been ready for quite a few months already. It's just that it's never been publicly documented. So that's honestly the case for a lot of Themelio projects. Like if you actually look into Themelio, it's probably a lot further along than you think. Like most of our tech stack is very mature already. It's just that we still need to document it and tell everybody about it.
And curiously, I mean, yeah, not enough documentation is a typical problem of like early days startup phase that you are on. I was just okay. lost completely the idea that I was gonna go with because I got thinking about documentation. Sorry. Yeah, no, but like in general, for the way I'm seeing Themelio evolve, I just remember what I wanted to say. This is a Hail Mary, 100%. This is like a weird question, but like I heard once, I was talking to the very much eccentric, super cool founder of a blockchain called Minima.
Mhm.
And he was telling me that in his mind, the blockchain of the future, which of course he claims he's building,
Mhm.
is going to be, it has to be verified by phones, and that like
Mhm.
actually you need mobile devices to be, yeah, to be running the network as much as possible because they're, well, super abundant, everyone has one. You
Mhm.
need to build in like a lean way that taps into those resources.
Mhm.
I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
I actually don't agree because I think that there is this meme, so to speak, that a blockchain security is better the more full nodes there are. I think like that's true up to a certain point, right? You need enough full nodes that if something goes wrong, at least one of them is honest and it sees it and it tells everybody. Like in Themelio, the auditor procedure kind of formalizes that. It tells everybody by literally sending everyone a message to shut the network down. But it's after I think you have like a few hundred or a few thousand full nodes around the globe, adding more doesn't really help security. And I don't agree with people who say that, okay, Bitcoin's centralized because you can't run a full node on your phone. I don't think that's really important. I do think, however, it's very important that thin clients, fully trustless thin clients that don't trust the full node they're connected to, that only trust the overall consensus of the network. I do think it's important that those are powerful and those are embeddable and those run on every device. I want a world where if you open your phone and you see, I don't know, your wallet balance or any other thing on the blockchain, you're seeing it through a fully verified full node. You're not seeing it because Etherscan said it's there. You're seeing it because you actually verified everything with a thin client. And I think like that's a big reason why Themelio focuses so much on powerful thin clients and making the thin client libraries easily embeddable in applications.
Does it does this change in any way, or does this affect how you think about ASICs?
I don't think ASICs are very relevant because ASICs are not used to verify the network, right? I think there is a
Mm.
common misconception that miners verify the network. Miners don't verify the network. Miners gatekeep the network. What verifies the network are the full nodes, right? They're in charge of like propagating and verifying every transaction. Miners also do so, but because miners are also full nodes. But the ASICs are not doing the verification. The ASICs are just hashing. So I honestly don't have much of an opinion on ASICs because I'm not Themelio is not a proof of work network. My preliminary thoughts are I actually think that ASICs are fine. I mean, they're just like money, right? It's just like proof of stake is money. Like stake is money. It's just like CPUs are money and GPUs are money. I don't think it actually matters all that much what devices in particular your proof of work runs on.
Right. In particular, in Monero, they're very obsessive about being ASIC resistant and all
Mm-hmm.
that. And I've always find it kind of like a bit ridiculous because that's like, yeah, just like proof of stake. You have sizes of stakes, you have sizes of computational power that pretty
I
much
do think that, like, in a sense, proof of stake is better than ASICs because it's much easier to buy assets and stake them than set up a efficient ASIC farming, ASIC mining like rig, right? And I do think that ASIC has unique centralization problems because, there are only a few places in the world that make ASICs that are effective for mining Bitcoins. And it's very centralized in that sense. Like the market for ASICs is very small.
right. And most people use the same producers. Most
Yeah,
people use the same sources, and yeah, they have a lot of power on the industry,
yeah,
whether by design or not. Although my intuition would be that it's by design.
yeah.
All right. Also, last question from my notes, and then I'm gonna start winging it. um, and this is something that I already asked you in the previous recording that we lost, but that I thought your answer on was pretty interesting. How do you think Themelio gets an edge over the competition as a blockchain of choice to build apps? Because, well, there are so many options out there. There are, of course, the options that are there are having a very hard time competing with Ethereum as the smart contract blockchain of choice. So I don't know how you see yourself in this competition.
Yeah, and I think how is that Themelio is not a smart contract blockchain, right? Themelio's whole data model and programming language is designed for writing basic protocols that have blockchain-based security. They're not designed for writing apps, right? So if you want to write a roll-up verification system or a payment channel network or, a naming system, it's very easy to do on Themelio, and it's very convenient to do so in our programming language. But if you're trying to build, I don't know, some on-chain game or something like that with very complex state and requiring lots of storage, you can build it on Themelio, but it's not designed for that use case. And you should go use Ethereum, or maybe you should make a rollup on Themelio that has a better language for that use case, right? So I think that's really the biggest difference. Themelio is designed for building infrastructure using it. It's not exactly designed to compete with Ethereum and doing what Ethereum does.
Which is
building apps, right? Ethereum is the global computer, right? That's its whole model. It has these stateful smart contracts. They have memory. They have hard drives, and you run. They remember things, and the cost is of course extremely high gas fees and also just general poor performance of Ethereum. But the solution is not trying to scale that. It's to switch to a totally different model of how you use blockchains, and that's what Themelio explores.
And this leads back to the follow-up question that I also asked in that one. Is, of course, you're saying that a lot of the things that are already out and are already popular and are already succeeding and got us to where we are inherently flawed, or that they just started from the wrong point or didn't know better than to solve the issues that they had at hand, but that there was an underlying bigger issue. So what do you say to the communities of Ethereum, of all these chains that according to your assumptions do not scale?
I don't actually think that existing blockchains are just totally bad and they started from the wrong assumptions. I think they're fine at what they do. It's just that I don't think they can support the kind of pervasive crypto, not really crypto. You see, I don't have a good word for that. Web3 is really cliche. Crypto is non-specific. But I would say pervasive adoption of trustless mechanisms that blockchains really promise to do. I don't think existing blockchains can actualize that because they're already very saturated with kind of these really niche things like DeFi and NFTs and things like that. And it's mostly some specific applications where the costs and the problems of existing blockchains are outweighed by the fact that you have to use blockchains to do those applications. But I think that if you want mass kind of adoption of decentralization and blockchain-based security, then you need a blockchain that is very different and is designed to be kind of a very removed root of trust. That's less like a platform for writing applications, but more like a security module that you use in whatever applications you build.
All right. Well, if I don't know if there's nothing else you'd like to add for the Themelio community or for people listening to this, I think we can start wrapping up. Any closing thoughts, Eric? As always, a pleasure talking to you, man.
Yeah, I think that a closing thought would be I'm actually very happy that kind of the crypto markets are kind of in turmoil now and people are reevaluating what's really important in the space. And I think that I really hope that kind of the industry comes out better and it kind of filters out the gimmicky yields and things like that and focuses people more on actually building valuable technology. And I do believe that Themelio would be a very big part of that. So I guess that's my closing thoughts on this whole situation.
And I mean, I don't think it's unlikely that we'll start to see a lot of NFT projects fail, a lot of DeFi applications that no one really asked for start failing. I think we're going to start seeing, like you said, a lot of failure across the industry, but I think it's going to be for the best and for the to set the foundations for those that are actually doing useful stuff to remain around and gain some power.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this was Eric Tung from Themelio. Thank you very much, man.
You too.